Welcome to Ruger Tech Tips. I'm going to show you how to reassemble your Ruger LCR revolver. We've done our cleaning on the revolver and now we're going to put it back together again. So first thing I want to do is make sure I have no live ammo in the gun or in my work area. Pretty simple. I can check my chambers of my cylinder and there's no live ammo in my work area. A couple tools you're going to need. I'm going to need a pair of vice grips. You're going to need a torque wrench that goes from 23 to 27 pounds of torque. You're also going to want a number 10 Torx bit driver, both for the torque wrench and the separate driver. Ideally, you would have an ejector support tool. We got this one from Brownells, but you could also use dummy rounds or spent casings would work. A 1/16 punch, a cleaning patch, and of course, a good pair of safety glasses. So to begin with, I'm going to build up my cylinder crane assembly as a sub-assembly. So we have our ejector spring, and this is non-directional, and there's a little bushing in that, and that goes inside the crane. So ideally, what you can do is you just take your spring, place it over that little bushing, push down, and it'll pick it up. So it's pretty handy. I'm going to come in from the back side, bushing first, and I'm just going to insert that inside the crane. This now can go inside my cylinder, and that'll snap together. Now, for the time when I was cleaning my gun, I kept my ejector rod onto my ejector. I want to preserve my thread locker on there, so I kept those screwed together. I took this off just before we started filming so I could keep the longevity of my thread locker on here. There is a D slot in our cylinder. You'll see that here. And there's a corresponding flat on my ejector. You're just going to line up those two flats when you assemble this and push my ejector all the way in. My center lock pin, that's the longer of the two pins, has a round end and a flat kind of a nail head to it. Round goes down, so round down. So I'm going to put that in first, drop that right down inside there. I have a center pin rod and I have a spring. The spring is non-directional, it doesn't matter which way that goes on the rod. If you look, that also has kind of a nail head to it, and that's going to go down too. So those two flats ride together, just remember that. So I want the flat end out, so that goes into my ejector rod. So the flat is going to line up with a flat, and I'm going to screw that in. Now remember, this is a left-hand thread, so you turn it counterclockwise to tighten it. So it's righty-loosey, lefty-tighty. Okay, so tighten that up. I would get that finger tight and stop there. Just bring it up with your fingers as tight as you can get it with your fingers. I'm going to take my cleaning patch, just as a patch so I don't scratch my end of my ejector rod, and my vice grips, and I'm going to lock that on there. Now caution, it's really, really easy to damage your ejector rod. You will snap your ejector right off clean if you over torque this. So you've got a lot of leverage here and not a lot of structure inside here against that leverage. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to hang on to that cylinder, and again, it's left-hand thread, so I'm going to turn this counterclockwise to tighten. I'm going to turn this maybe a 1/16 to an 1/8 of a turn, just barely going to turn that. Okay, not much. I don't want to overturn that. If you turn too much of that, you will snap that ejector rod off, then the gun's coming back to us. I checked its motion, I checked that this is spinning, looks good. I can now take this and put this right inside my cylinder frame. I can set that to one side. So next up, I am going to start with building up my fire control unit, and I'm going to start at the back end. I'm going to start building up my hammer. So I'm going to grab my hammer, the strut, the little strut pivot, aka the dog bone, my spring, and my pivot. So I'm going to get those assembled in front of me. So I'm going to take my strut, I'm going to put that inside the hammer, and I'm going to take my little dog bone here, I'm going to push that inside. And you can feel with your fingers that lined up. Now just word of caution, what holds that in is the tension when you build this up. So that can fall out. Spring is non-directional, it doesn't matter which way that goes in. You're going to have to grab your seat. Now the seat is somewhat directional. If you notice, it has a flat on it and just has to be parallel to the sides of the hammer. So our lower has an open side and a closed side. I keep the open side up, and I'm going to fish this down inside there, and it's just going to seat. There's two little posts in there, and it gets between those two posts, and that's the correct position where it's going to sit down in there. I then am going to take my thumb and I can compress my hammer down, line up my pivot hole. I can just compress that down with my thumb, get my pivot in there, press that all the way through, and I'm just going to check my motion of that. Everything looks good. So the hammer assembly is in. Next, I'm going to grab my trigger, the trigger spring, there's a little bushing, the trigger pivot pin, and the pawl. I'm going to build this up as a little bit of a sub-assembly. Now, if you look at the trigger spring here, it has a short leg and a long leg. The long leg is going to go to the rear, towards the hammer, where this front leg is going to go towards the muzzle. Now, the tip of this leg, the short leg, is actually held in place. It wants to get captured on the top of the frame here, inside. And that's what it's going to give its tension. It's possible to have it go through the slot where the cylinder latch goes through. We'll give you some cautions on that. The long leg sits inside the trigger. There's a little slot in there, and that's where it wants to end up. So just pay attention to that, where that long leg, which goes to the rear, is going to go inside the slot, inside the trigger. How we build this up: I'm going to take my trigger spring, I'm going to put the little bushing in. It's non-directional, just doesn't matter which way it goes in. And I'm going to set that inside my trigger. So long leg to the rear, short leg to the front. There's a little circle, what would be on the right-hand side in the shooting position. On the trigger, there's a post on my pawl that goes into that, and I can hold that upright like that. And I can just set this whole unit down. Now remember, the trigger has to go into the front first, and then it's going to slide to the rear. So I'm going to kind of roll that in. And once I can kind of get that lined up, I can take my trigger pivot pin, and it's non-directional, doesn't matter which way I stick that in. I'm going to get the trigger pivoting first, going to start that, and then I can line up my spring, move that in the proper position, and run the trigger pivot right through everything. You want that pivot pin flush on each side, so it doesn't want to stick out proud on one side. And I'm just going to push that to the rear. It may move while you reassemble the rest of it, but I'm just going to push it to the rear, start in that position. Pull your trigger slightly to the rear, which is going to expose this post on the trigger. You're going to grab your transfer bar, and the transfer bar, it's going to ride on this pivot here. It has a post on the upper body of it. That post wants to be behind the pawl, to the rear of the pawl. So I'm going to pull my trigger. I'm going to install my transfer bar on that, and I'm going to get the post behind the pawl like that, and I'm bring my trigger forward, get it like that. You actually seat the transfer bar underneath the hammer. There's a lip edge on the front of the hammer, and I'm just going to compress that back. It'll push the hammer back, and you hear it click, and I make sure I put my fingers on either side to make sure it's centered. If it sticks too far out on one side, this little post will actually drag on the frame going in. So I just get my fingers on either side and make sure it's centered. We're good there. And again, I'm going to double check that spring, make sure it's back. Next, we have our cylinder latch, and we have our little tiny cylinder latch spring, and there's a small post on the bottom side of that, and it's just going to go into that post. It's just going to sit there. And I'm going to take my cylinder latch and spring and just put it down inside there, and it'll kind of click down in place. And if the transfer bar and the hammer are in the correct position, your pivot will pretty much go straight on through. So now I've set up my lower to install my cylinder latch. So my fire control housing is ready to install. I'm going to take my number 10 Torx bit. I'm going to preload this, so my screw is on there, so that's one less thing to deal with. I'm going to hang onto my cylinder frame in my left hand, my muzzle towards me, and I'm going to roll my cylinder so my notch lines up with a hole here. We're going to be pivoting from this upper corner on both of these, and we're going to bring the two together like a hinge. I need to make sure that this trigger spring is all the way to the rear. You can see the pawl kicking forward because that's what drives the pawl, so I can bring these two together. So, and it's somewhat of, once you get things lined up, it's a little bit of a quick motion. So I'm going to bring the twos together. I'm going to see that my transfer bar and my pawl line up, and then I'm just going to snap the two together. I then am going to swing my left thumb down around, so I'm holding it tight together. I can take my screw with my number 10 Torx bit, and I'm going to screw that in. Once you get that snugged up, we need to torque that screw in between 23 and 27 inch-pounds of torque. So I've got my torque wrench set here. I'm going to engage that, and I'm going to bring that up. So that clicks off. I need to install my upper screws. Now, not all the revolvers have these. Different models vary. They don't all have that. I'm going to take my 1/16 punch. I'm going to go through the screws. If you look at that little nut carefully, you'll see that there's an octagonal shape on one end. The octagonal shape goes in first, and I'm just going to put that inside the hole. You'll turn it, you'll feel it lock in, and then I put my finger on there and pull that out. Put the screw in from the other side. This screw only gets torqued down to 3 to 9 inch-pounds of torque. Not very much. You're unlikely to find a torque wrench that goes that light. So typically how I put these in is I'm going to screw this in. I can start to feel when I get a little bit of resistance. Okay, right there. I use just 2 fingers. I turn it ever so slightly, and you're done. Okay, that's it. You do not want to over torque that, because what you will do is you will strip that polymer out, and that screw is just going to spin. Lastly, I'm going to put my grips on. And we had a couple different variations. Some were a slotted screw, so you'll need a slotted screwdriver. Or this is the later models were a number 10 Torx bit, just like everything else. So I'm just going to screw this down in. And this just needs to be snug. Snug that up. So I want to make sure I've done everything correctly. So first thing I'm going to check is inside my window, I want to see, is my spring leg sticking up from my cylinder latch spring, or my trigger spring? And it's not, so I assembled that correctly. I'm going to open and close, make sure that works, move my ejector. I'm going to try my trigger pull. Cylinder rotates, everything feels normal. Feels like I've got good trigger turn, feels like we have reassembled everything correctly. So thank you for watching this Ruger Tech tip.